1960, Tanbing Laoding, China. 1 in 20 villagers has died of starvation. A report states that several children have been eaten. February 25, 1960, Hongtai Commune, Laohejia Village. Yang Zhongchen, a poor farmer, is arrested for a recent crime. The victim is Yang Ershun. The report states relationship with the culprit younger brother, manner of crime, killed and eaten. Reason? Livelihood issues. That same report includes other victims of cannibalism in that same city. 12 were killed and eaten, 16 died of other causes and were eaten after. 48 bodies were exhumed and eaten. These numbers were of course very small in the great scheme of things relating to a so-called Great Famine, but there's arguably nothing sadder and more shocking than people resorting to eating members of their own family. The desperation felt all over China in those dark days was something most people will never understand, but today we'll try and help you get there. The man who was responsible for this wickedness, or at least the person we find more guilty than any other man, was Mao Zedong. Let's first have a look at how he rose up to become what some people have said is the worst mass murderer in the history of tyrants. Mao came into this world on December 26, 1893 in the small rural community of Shaoshan in the province of Hunan, China. His family were farmers, just as many people were in this area, with Mao himself leaving school to work in the fields at the age of 13. It seems he didn't take to farming as his father had wanted. Instead, he enjoyed books and poetry. He was especially fond of science and philosophy, and even at a young age had his head in the sometimes difficult works of the philosopher and economist Karl Marx. Mao got his wish when at the age of 17 he went off to study, which led to him joining the Revolutionary Army and the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang. In 1911, Mao supported the Qinghai Revolution, the event that put an end to Imperial China and its Qing dynasty. At this point, Mao was still a nobody, and although he qualified to work as a teacher, the jobs never came and he ended up working in a library in Beijing. This was an exciting time for Mao, who was intently watching Russia from a distance when it had its revolution in 1917. Communism was the way forward, Mao thought, inspired by the likes of Marx and the first head of Soviet Russia, Vladimir Lenin. No sooner than the Chinese Communist Party was formed, Mao became a member. China was a country whose peasants had known much suffering and experienced many terrible famines, and Mao believed that had to change. Communism, he reckoned, was the way forward. Power to the people, the simple farming folks, was what the young Mao said in his head each night as he drifted off to sleep. The short version of the story is that the Chinese Nationalist Party fell out with the Communist Party, and with the latter being persecuted by the former, there was an uprising and Mao was at the forefront of it. We apologize for the brevity here, but there's so much we have to explain later. Basically, Mao led the Red Army against the Nationalists, and in 1934 he formed the Soviet Republic of China, putting 10 Chinese provinces under communist control. His bands of peasant guerrillas were hunted down. The Long March happened, which was actually a series of marches of communist armies in retreat from the Kuomintang army. The distance covered was some 8,000 miles, and on the way many people died, perhaps as many as 30,000, but many more endured that perilous journey to the end. And if any name was mentioned in the capacity of heroism, it was Mao's. It was this period in history that would cement his popularity. There were facts and there was mythology, something that many years later helped Mao secure a so-called cult of personality. There was still a split in the country in 1937 when the Japanese invaded, and what happened next further helped Mao construct a mythology about himself. His Red Army fought with the Allied forces against the Japanese invaders, and when the war was over, he was in a strong position to rule over all of China. The nationalist politician, revolutionary, and military leader Chiang Kai-shek made a peace agreement with Mao. But in the end, there wasn't much peace. The communist forces grew in size, aided by weapons sent to them by Joseph Stalin, the most powerful person in the Soviet Union. The fight raged on. The peasants rallied for the communists, millions upon millions of them. Hundreds of thousands died on both sides, but it was the communists that won in the end, helped a lot by the nationalists having their hands full with Japan in the war. When it was done, Mao promised change. He promised to redistribute the land, to make life fairer, and the peasants bought into it. He may have had good intentions, but little did anyone know right then that things would take a turn for the worse. The understatement of the century. Still, Mao did battle against warlords who'd ruled over the countryside with an iron fist. He did manage to reduce the number of opium addicts in the country, and he did create policies that made it more possible for the poor to get a formal education. His policies even improved life expectancy for the poor, but that was about to change drastically. Times were better, though, at this point for many people whose lives had been a living hell. Chairman Mao was indeed a champion of the people, even if that meant the summary executions of landowners, at times burying those folks while they were still breathing. As Mao often alluded, you need to break a lot of eggs to make an omelet, or, in his words, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. All over China, things were changing fast. Mao spoke about the enemies of the rural classes, those wicked landowners that had oppressed them for years. In villages throughout the country, they were executed one by one, with a scholar later saying there was at least one landlord and usually several in virtually every village for public execution. Sometimes their wives were spared but were forced into being concubines for the once persecuted. Mao's omelet was bloody. There's no doubt about that, with some sources saying there were 200,000 to 800,000 executions, and other sources stating it was more like 2 to 5 million. Those are some big differences, but as you'll see today, scholars often vehemently disagree over numbers when it comes to Mao's China. Now you might be thinking, surely a lot of people complained and protested about these violent land reforms, and you'd be right to think that. Mao even created something called the 100 Flowers campaign, which was supposed to let people air their grievances about the party and its policies. Some did just that, and many of them were the folks who Mao distrusted the most, the intellectuals and those Mao believed were rightists. After speaking their minds, these people were often sent straight to prison or sent to work in the labor camps, which was often a ticket to a slow death. Mao did seem to embrace a critique at the start, but that later changed. Hundreds of thousands were persecuted this way. These were sometimes members of his own party, but also regular folks he suspected of holding rightist views. As an example, in Gansu province, two men named Sun Daiyankai and Lang Daijun had expressed that Mao's idea for a project to conserve water wouldn't work. They were subsequently called anti-party by Mao and punished. That project went ahead and entailed a hard graft of around 160,000 people. They basically were asked to move mountains and were worked half to death, having to survive by living in caves and foraging for food. This was just one of many Mao's ideas that failed, and failed badly. It's estimated that 2,400 of the workers died from the toil itself. And guess how much clean water came out of it? None. It was a complete failure. Although not something many people wanted to talk about. That was the thing about such harebrained projects. If anyone criticized them, they were denounced as being anti-party. But many people in the party believed that they were really changing the world for the better and making China a country that would be more powerful than the UK and close even to the USA. One of those officials said, "We are supernatural. Maybe on another planet there are people who are brighter than we are, in which case we are of the second order. But if we are brighter than they are, we are the supernaturals of the first order." To be as powerful as Britain, Mao said that China's steel output had to be significantly increased. In 1958, all over China, the people of the villages had their own little steel refineries in their backyards. A nation was hell-bent on massive production. As was always the case with the Communist Party, this was watched over by every commune's boss, aka the cadres. Daily targets had to be met, and those targets were often unrealistic. This was all part of Mao's Great Leap Forward, summed up by one scholar like this. Mao thought that he could catapult the country past its competitors by herding villagers across the country into giant people's communes. In pursuit of a utopian paradise, everything was collectivized. People had their work, homes, land, belongings, and livelihoods taken from them. In collective canteens, food distributed by the spoonful according to merit became a weapon used to force people to follow the party's every dictate. Mao wasn't going around China to every village. Instead, there were lower-ranking party members responsible for making those targets, and they often ruled over communes with exceptional brutality. Those local cadres would often inflate the production figures just to make the party officials happy. But when that happened, and it happened a lot, the leaders started seeing success where there wasn't any. Many of those villagers were worked to death, and there was often the punishment of going without food if they didn't meet their targets, so some slowly starved to death. Others simply had the life beaten out of them. By April 1958, hunger was widespread all over China. In Guangxi, 1 in every 6 people had no food. In Shandong, 670,000 people were on the verge of starving to death. In Anhui, it was 1.3 million. Mao had hoped to make China great again with the Great Leap Forward, but if China was leaping anywhere, it was into the furnace, metaphorically speaking. This was the result of forced labor for steel production, but also various other projects. It meant that these people weren't doing what they usually did, which was growing food. But the cadres also lied about food production. In just one place called Luxi, the local head wrote back to Beijing to say every farmer was producing 300 kilos of grain a year, when the real figure was half that. This was going on everywhere. In another province, the grain production was 82,000 tons in 1957. In 1960, it was 18,000 tons, but the boss told party officials it was 130,000 tons. The outcome of this so-called target fever was starvation on a massive scale. The party, never thinking too deeply, once had the people going on a huge sparrow killing campaign since sparrows ate crops. What happened? There was an insect explosion and the insects ate the crops. At the time, some cadres were in fact writing to Mao talking about such widespread devastation, the brave ones anyway, and while Mao did sometimes slow down production, people kept on dying in huge numbers. Then to build all this marvelous industry, Mao needed tools and technology in China. The best place to buy these things, of course, was Russia, and buy he did, as well as sending massive amounts of grain over to the Soviet Union. That was the grain the people needed to survive on. But no problem, because when cadres did the books, it often looked as though the villages still had enough grain for themselves. In time, some party members did talk about the millions of people that were starving and sometimes stated that steel projects and water projects just weren't working. They did say that too much grain was being taken from the countryside to the cities and abroad, but often they ended up either losing their jobs or worse, being sent to prison or killed. Everyone was supposed to think as the vice chairman of the Communist Party Lin Biao did when he denounced those naysayers as anti-party folks and the enemy of the one and true great leader. He said on a stage in 1959, "Only Mao is a great hero, a role to which no one else should dare to aspire. We all lag very far behind him, so don't even think about it." This is why when we talk about the many millions that died in China back then, we can't just blame Mao but much of the machinery of the men behind him. Still, he was the boss. He was the one that could have reversed things. In Fuyang, 2.4 million people died in total from 1959 to 1961 out of a population of 8 million. In Guangshan in 1959 alone, 1 in every 4 of the 600,000 people had died from starvation. In Xinjiang, 1 million people died. Mass graves were everywhere. 67,000 of them had died from being beaten with sticks. There, local militias stole the little food there was and didn't take kindly to anyone complaining that they had none. Some officials did see this happening, with one report stating bad people have seized power, causing beatings, deaths, grain shortages, and hunger. But get this, the report said it was not the fault of Communist Party policies, but because all the rightists that had stirred up trouble and caused havoc in these little towns and villages. All those deaths, the report said, were down to the enemies of the party. Sure, there were counter-revolutionaries around, but most of them were just desperate as hell. They were watching their families grow thin and die. They were being worked to death and their grain was being sent elsewhere. What were they supposed to do? In short, this was an agricultural nightmare, and you can blame the Great Leap Forward for that. There were also some other matters such as failed harvests that resulted in mass deaths, but the party could take most of the blame, especially as so many officials were afraid to report anything negative lest they be seen as counter-revolutionaries. In the villages, the houses of people were torn down to become fuel for the never-ending quotas of supplies. That left people not just without food, but without a roof over their heads. If they complained, they were usually beaten vigorously, sometimes to death. In Hunan alone, 40% of the houses were torn down, and occupants were told they had to make do with whatever they could find to protect themselves from the elements. Mao knew about this. He'd been told in a letter written by another party official named Liu Shaoqi. It didn't matter. Mao just saw this as another small setback. The journalist Yang Jisheng wrote a book based on interviews of the people that had lived through this horrible experience. In one story, someone told him that 13 children went to an official and pleaded for some food. The kids were subsequently taken far away to a mountainous area, and all of them died from exposure. Jisheng wrote, "I was 18 at the time and I only knew what the Communist Party told me. Everyone was fooled." He said every tree around his village was stripped of its bark because the bark was the only thing to eat. In other cases, villagers ripped out weeds and wildflowers and baked them in mud pies. It stopped the hunger but made them very sick. Jisheng's book was later banned in China, to which he responded with the words, "It's an offense to the memories of tens of millions." People walked away from their destroyed villages in the hope of finding anything to eat. Many sold their clothes on these long walks just for the smallest amount of food. In the winter, this was deadly, but bodies were also useful. There's a report from the Shandong archives that says local cadres used the dead as fertilizer. In another village of 45 people, 44 died from starvation. The last remaining woman was found having gone completely insane. In another village, a teenage orphan killed her own younger brother and ate him. Sometimes the dead were dug up and cooked with hot peppers to disguise the taste of rotten meat. One time, a cadre reported to an official what was going on, to which he received the reply, "That's right deviationist thinking. You're viewing the problem in an overly simplistic manner." All of these stories were taken from the Chinese archives and used in books on Mao, some of which we have in front of us now. In one book, in the chapter called Survival, it talks about how some of those local cadres lived like pigs and ate to their heart's content as the people died around them. Others turned to crime. In one province alone, in a period of just 2 months, 500 granaries were robbed. On top of that, the trains carrying the grain were often held up and their contents taken by desperate thieves. Sometimes, when the cadres announced a new unrealistic grain quota at a time when people were starving, there was a rebellion, and the leading figures were cut to pieces by meat cleavers and beaten with sticks. But what could people do? Some just left the villages in what became a large exodus and tried to make it to the cities. Many of them were dying on the way. This is the story of one family that was on such a trek when they stopped in front of a man who had food. The father, Wu Jingqi, gave away his 9-year-old kid for a bowl of rice and some peanuts. In another case, a mother named Wang Weitong sold her son for a couple of pennies and 4 steamed buns. We must remember here that the mother and father may well have done this not just for the food, but thinking that the new owners of the children might help them survive. Another story from Xinhong tells us that a mother and her young child tried to escape from an irrigation project. Both were bayoneted to death on the spot. In another case, the folks that tried to run were rounded up and stuffed in a house that was then blown up with dynamite. Many people were just turned back when they actually made it to the city. In 1960, 380,000 peasants were turned away from Sichuan, and really, where did they have to go? They'd already risked life and limb to get there. The factories in the cities themselves were horrific places to work, but they were better than eating boiled leather, tree bark, your mother, or your brother. In the factories, women had it the worst. They went months without washing in many cases, and venereal disease was rife. One pregnant woman one day didn't turn up to work, presumably because she was sick. When she next appeared at the factory, she was told to take all her clothes off and go and break ice outside in the cold. For men and women, being stripped naked seemed to have been a common kind of humiliating punishment, and this was supposed to be progress. You'd think in Asian culture the elderly would have been respected and cared for, but they were often just left to die. They died much quicker too, given their bodies were not as strong as the young. Just as the young had to lift heavy objects and work from sunrise to sundown, in the eyes of the party, the elderly had to do their bit too. Often, they weren't strong enough to join an exodus. In one village in Hubei, everyone had left a once bustling place. When someone found the village, it was deadly quiet. 4 out of the 6 people left behind were old. They were barely surviving by eating grass and leaves. Do you want to hear more? We could go on, and we must admit, due to the sensibilities of YouTube, we've left out some of the more disturbing details. We've also not included the many disease deaths or the many industrial accidents, such as collapsed mines built too quickly run by despicable cadres. We didn't talk about the deaths at the gulags, or for that matter, the thousands executed there and the hundreds of thousands that died from malnutrition in the gulags. And what about regular violence? The cadres had a saying they liked to use: kill a chicken to scare the monkey. That basically meant show people you'll use extreme violence and other folks will think twice about getting out of line. The stick was often a weapon of choice. Shockingly, people suffering from starvation-related edema were hit with sticks, with the expression used, beating the water out of them. That meant the liquid building up in them was beaten out. One official said if you want to become a party member, you must know how to beat people. An investigation team from Beijing once arrived at a village and called what they saw a torture field. On one reservoir project in Huangkai, 4,000 from 16,000 villagers were beaten. A quarter of them died. There were indeed killing fields everywhere. One boy was beaten to death for stealing a tiny bit of wheat. In Huan, 300 people were accused of one winter's day of not working hard enough, and they were all told to strip and work. 1 in 7 of them died. Sometimes those accused of slacking were branded with hot irons or pierced with needles. One entire family was forced to sit in a vat of excrement after the father had tried to steal a sweet potato for them. He died 3 weeks later after more punishment, which included being force-fed that poop. In Hunan, there was a report of a whole family being bricked up in a house and left to die. A similar thing had happened to other families. The head of the province, Zhou Xiaozhou, at least ordered an investigation after he'd found out. In another report from Daoshan, it showed many thousands had died. 10% of them had been buried alive. In another report, a man in Hunan village was forced by boss Zhao Deshang to bury his own son alive just because the son had tried to steal a morsel of grain. The archival report said the father died from grief 3 weeks later. Not all the cadres were that brutal. In one province, 260 of them lost their jobs for not beating the people hard enough. 30 of those cadres died from their beating. The numbers are debated, but we do know that the number of deaths ranged from 30 to 45 million. Over the normal number of deaths in China. Around 2 to 3 million were tortured to death or executed. Some scholars put the total number at 55 million deaths, which alone makes Mao's run in charge as one of the most horrific disasters in the history of humankind. People still argue about the numbers, but no one denies millions died needlessly and often violently. Mao knew what was happening. In the minutes of a secret meeting held in Shanghai on March 25, 1959, it was revealed that he said, "When there's not enough to eat, people starve to death. It's better to let half the people die so the other half can eat their fill." But he wasn't done with death, not by a long way. In January 1962, the man we've already mentioned, named Liu Shaoqi, stood in front of cadres in Beijing at the 7,000 Cadres Conference. Shaoqi spoke the truth and said what had happened could have been prevented. The disaster had been man-made. This was some pronouncement given the pervasive fear that had throttled China for years. Mao took partial responsibility and stepped down from leadership, and Shaoqi stepped up. Again, cutting a long story short, let's just say that Mao would get his own back on Shaoqi, but that was after he took control of something called the Cultural Revolution. Starting in 1966, Mao used this revolution to silence his critics and monopolize control. He would make himself a god. He'd drum up the anger of young people all over China to do his often violent bidding. So you won't be surprised to hear that Shaoqi was later denounced by Mao as an enemy and a traitor, and he was beaten on a few occasions while being denied his much-needed medicine. He died soon after, but many years later would end up at least being judged more fairly and have the renegade, traitor, and scab accusation removed from his name. But how did Mao manage to turn things around after falling foul of the party and before that ruining a country? Well, he used propaganda on a large part of the public who for the most part were not that educated. Remember Mao's famous words, "To read too many books is harmful." Mao wanted people to read from the right books. He wanted people to read his own philosophy, what became known as Maoism. The working class folks and poor farmers were still living perilously close to abject poverty. So when a seemingly strong leader told them that he was behind them in their struggles, they grabbed hold of those words out of desperation. Mao was clever. He told the nation that they needed to learn from a deceased soldier named Li Feng. This is called mythology making, a dictator's ace in the hole. Feng had died at the age of 21, but he left behind a diary. Inside this war hero's book were entries that talked about the proletarian struggle and the rise of a wonderful country. And guess who had inspired him the most? Mao, of course. One entry went, "Yesterday I had a dream. I dreamt of seeing Chairman Mao. Like a compassionate father, he stroked my head. With a smile, he spoke to me. Do a good job in your studies. Be forever loyal to the party, loyal to the people." Mao would tell huge crowds that the nation needed to listen to heroes like this man who'd given his life for the common good. Yeah, you want to throw up right now, but it actually worked. The only thing is, Li Feng was a work of propaganda. It's almost certain no man with this name wrote that stuff in a diary, and it's possible Feng never existed at all. And that's why it pays to read books about propaganda techniques throughout history. Plays and movies were made about this fictional lad who loved his Chairman Mao. Songs about him moved an entire nation. One of them included the lyrics, "Don't forget what to love and what to hate. Learn from Feng's good example. Be willing to make a revolution. The collective ideology shines. Remember Chairman Mao's guidance in your hearts. The revolution will last forever." Meanwhile, Mao lived in luxury as his so-called people ate scraps. He preached about embracing the struggle and wore expensive robes. He taught people to embrace stoicism just as fiction Feng had, as he ate like a king. Girls were regularly told they had to go visit the chairman in his bedroom. As one writer stated, their numbers increased as their age decreased, and several left his room with an STD. The writer added, the illness transmitted by Mao was a badge of honor, testimony to their close relations with the chairman. Mao went a step further in 1966, starting a campaign that you could compare to something that happens on social media platforms today. He started a poster campaign, so everywhere a person went, they saw pictures showing this great leader, or his devoted people putting their fists in the air in support of this ideal man. This was the same man who had led his country in a bloodbath. He then attacked the people he said were to blame for the country's problems. These were the traitors, and many of them were intellectuals, teachers, folks who might have been mentally armed against his propaganda. That meant that there was a problem in the universities for Mao. People learned in those places about history and cultures of the world. Mao didn't really like that. He partly blamed the Ministry of Culture. One time he decided it was time to change its name and he came up with, we kid you not, the Ministry of Gifted Scholars and Beautiful Ladies. Then he thought, I really hate them reading about other cultures, so he came up with the name, the Ministry of Foreign Dead People. About 1 month later, he was still going on about how these dead folks from history were dangerous to the cause. We might recall here a great writer who had watched the horrors of the world wars and authoritarianism and saw in his crystal ball the future of endless conflicts and even the widespread use of drones. His name was George Orwell. In his book 1984, he wrote of an authoritarian government called Big Brother and how it controlled the thoughts of a nation. A famous phrase went, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Orwell was long dead before Mao's Cultural Revolution, but Mao's education policies were indeed kind of Orwellian thought police. Mao wanted to control truth, and to do it, he had to rewrite history and get rid of anyone who had what he perceived as the wrong kind of thoughts. Like Stalin had done, he took control of the arts. His big brother face was everywhere. He vilified intellectualism. And then he spread around one of the most read books in history. That was his Little Red Book, which included 267 aphorisms that he said ordinary people should live by. It included these lines, war is a continuation of politics, and there are at least two types, just, progressive, and unjust wars. which only serve bourgeois interests. While no one likes war, we must remain ready to wage just wars against imperialist agitation. An army that is cherished and respected by the people and vice versa is a nearly invincible force. The army and the people must unite on the grounds of basic respect. Young people carried it everywhere. They had it in their pockets when they marched into schools and dragged out their former teachers, accusing them of being rightist and imperialist running dogs and spies. Things were about to get very ugly. These students formed their own Red Guard, and they walked into schools and pulled out teachers by their hair, who they accused of being enemies to the cause. They beat them and humiliated them and tortured them. Mao's young followers said they were born with pure red blood, and their mission in life was to hunt down the bourgeoisie traitors. They did that at the 3rd Middle School for Girls in Beijing, when they dragged out the principal and beat him to death. They left a message on the wall, "Long live the Red Terror." Soon after, at Beijing Teachers College, they took a female teacher and kicked her down the stairs, killing her. In other schools, where the kids doing the bullying were no older than 13, they ganged up on their teachers and forced them to swallow excrement. All over the place, these educated teachers were deemed dangerous intellectuals. The students murdered a woman named Lao Shi, and then they went to her father's house. This guy, named Nan Baoshan, they also beat to death. They beat his son too and locked him in the house, where he later died of thirst. Again, all these stories are taken from the Chinese archives. Hundreds were clubbed to death, stabbed, kicked down the stairs, throughout Beijing and on its peripheries. The nightmare of violence was back again. The old world had to die, they said, and blood had to be spilled to make a new world. Persecution spread all over the country, with around 400,000 educated people being told they had to leave the cities where they lived, usually after being beaten. It was a reign of terror. Their social media of the day was putting up photographs of traitors or writing their names on walls and calling for their removal. These people waved their little red books in the air and shouted slogans supporting their brilliant and selfless leader. More years passed and more people were accused of being reactionary capitalists and spies, nothing more than agents of the bad people in the West. Just to give you an idea of the carnage, in just the province of Yunnan, the witch hunts took the lives of 17,000 people and, according to one book, crippled another 61,000. Many towns fell under the suspicion of not allying with the cause, especially if a religious minority lived there. Thousands of Mongols were beaten to death, many more were made homeless. The Red Guard filled up trucks where they traveled great distances to do their worst. They barely had food to eat and even did their toilet in these trucks, all for the great cause. Hundreds of thousands of people from the cities were forced into the countryside where they had no idea how to survive. Many of them lived perilously close to starvation. What did clerks and teachers and accountants know about farming? More purges followed. In Hubei alone, 173,000 people were under investigation for what was said to be counter-revolutionary activities. Anyone really, especially educated folks, were investigated. Even party members were under suspicion, and they could soon find themselves doing hard labor or slowly dying in a dark prison cell. If you wanted to keep power as a dictator, just as paranoid Stalin had done, you needed to clean house often. Who knows how many people were murdered during these very bleak and black years? Estimates differ wildly, with the lowest number being put at 250,000 deaths, but the highest at 2 million. As for those city dwellers that were beaten and forced to go live in the countryside, estimates put the number at 10 million. How many so-called bad elements were beaten badly, publicly humiliated, harassed so much that they couldn't take it anymore, that number's huge alone, or lost every material item they had in life? We're talking about a significant amount of a very large population, an incomprehensible figure, and all because of one man. After the death of Stalin, Mao had feared the people of the Soviet Union would turn against hardcore communism. Stalin might have dissed Mao when they met, but Mao still looked up to him. Then, when Mao saw the new leader Khrushchev denounce Stalin and his deathly purges, Mao of course wondered if he too might be denounced. Mao knew he needed his reign of terror to hold on to power. Just as the French revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre had said, you have to strike terror into the hearts of the people. And back to Orwell and something he called doublespeak, both Robespierre and Mao said terror equals virtue. Mao saw himself as being the pinnacle of communism all over the world. He once explained his idea of virtue, saying, "Our objective is to struggle against and crush those persons in authority who are taking the capitalist road, so as to facilitate the consolidation and development of the socialist system." He was a dictator that caused a great famine and whose ideas led to people in the countryside killing and eating their own families. His idealism led to 20th century witch hunts that saw innocent people beaten to death with sticks by an angry mob of young folks who had no idea they'd been brainwashed. And guess who one of his victims was? Whose family was humiliated and beaten and forced to move to the countryside? His name? Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader. His sister died as a result of the disgusting humiliation she experienced, and his mother was forced to denounce his father. The father was then sent to a prison, and she, just aged 15, was sent to the countryside where he and the rest of his now distraught family had to live in a cave. So, surely, Mao must have come under an avalanche of criticism in more recent times. He died, by the way, in 1976, and the Cultural Revolution died with him, even though it had petered out before that. It seems some powerful elements in China don't embrace the adage, "Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it." In 2017, there were reports of Chinese scholars and others losing their jobs for criticizing Mao. And while she has at times talked about more criticism of the past being needed, too much criticism is not good when authoritarianism reigns. Certain words in some places can get you in big trouble, just as the man Orwell had warned with those immortal words, "In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." Arm yourselves with knowledge, viewers, so you don't become a weapon for someone with dangerous ideas. Now you need to watch Terrifying Story of Joseph Stalin's Rise to Power, or have a look at this.